The observation room of the Xylar science vessel Chronicler was silent, save for the low hum of atmospheric processors. Three beings of immense age and wisdom stood before a view screen that displayed a live feed from a desolate, rocky world. Their forms were tall and slender, with skin the color of aged parchment and large, dark eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of countless galactic civilizations. They were the Keepers of Pain, a specialized sect of Xylar scholars dedicated to the scientific study of suffering. Their mission was to observe, record, and categorize the diverse ways sentient life experienced distress. It was a morbid field, but one they considered vital to understanding the universe. On the screen, a lone figure sat with his back against a jagged boulder. He was a human, a species the Xylar had only recently encountered and found utterly fascinating in their primitive resilience, and his name was not important to them. He was simply Specimen H7. His environment was a nightmare. The atmosphere was a thin, toxic mix of methane and ammonia, forcing him to wear a bulky environmental suit with a cracked and repaired helmet. The gravity was nearly double his planet's norm, making every movement a conscious effort. He had been stranded here for 7 of his planet's days after a scout ship malfunction. The lead scholar, Elder Zilvra, adjusted a dial, fine-tuning the biotelemetry feed they had secretly patched into the human suit. On their secondary screen, a cascade of data flowed, spiking cortisol levels, elevated heart rate, erratic neural activity indicating severe sleep deprivation, and muscle fatigue readings that were off the scale. "Remarkable," Zilvra murmured, his voice a dry rustle. "The physiological markers of extreme duress are all present. His body is in a state of constant high-alert failure, and he persists." The second scholar, a female named Thessa, tilted her head. "Observe his behavior. He is not simply enduring. He is acting." On the screen, the human had pushed himself to his feet, his movements clumsy in the heavy gravity. He walked to a small pile of rocks he had assembled, carefully rearranging them. It was a futile act, a pattern with no practical purpose. He was creating a marker, a sign, an attempt to impose order on chaos. "He continues to fight his environment," Thessa noted, her voice filled with clinical wonder. "Despite the certainty of his situation, our long-range scans show no rescue craft within a radius of 3 sectors. His ship's communication array is a melted lump of metal. He has no hope of rescue, and yet his brain does not register this. It continues to generate problem-solving scenarios, however impossible." The third scholar, Old Velk, who had catalogued the death throes of 1,000 species, was less impressed. "It is the madness of a cornered creature, the final desperate thrashing of a nervous system that cannot accept its own termination. We have seen it before in lesser beings. The Grix hoard energy they will never use. The Vorth sacrifice to gods they will never meet. It is a biological glitch, a refusal to compute the finality of 0. Let us record the final stages. The pain will become exquisite as his life support fails." As if on cue, a warning chime emanated from the human's suit speakers, picked up by their long-range audio sensors. The translation software on the Xylar ship converted the warning. "Oxygen levels critical, 12% remaining." On the screen, the human froze. He looked down at the gauntlet on his wrist where the warning flashed. He didn't panic. He didn't cry out. He simply stared at it for a long moment. Then he did something that made all 3 Xylar scholars lean forward in unison. And he began to laugh. It was a dry, rasping sound, barely a whisper in the thin atmosphere, but it was unmistakably a laugh. He slapped his knee with a gloved hand, the sound a dull thump. He shook his head, still chuckling, and looked up at the sky, at the distant, indifferent stars. The laughter stopped as abruptly as it had started. He took a deep, ragged breath, the air hissing into his suit. Then he began to speak. He was alone, with no possibility of anyone hearing him. Yet he spoke. And he spoke to the uncaring wind, to the rocks, to the void. "You know," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble, his words captured by the sensitive microphones of the Xylar ship, "I always thought I'd go out in a blaze of glory, something heroic, charging a machine gun nest, pushing a kid out of the way of a bus, not sitting on a rock, waiting to suffocate because my ship's nav computer had a short circuit." He paused, looking at his gloved hands. "My father used to say, 'Son, a life's what happens when you're busy making other plans.' I guess dying is the same way." He looked around, his gaze sweeping over the bleak landscape. 7 days. I built a cairn. I calculated the orbital mechanics of this planet's 3 moons. I named a rock Gerald. Gerald's been a good friend. Not much of a conversationalist, but a great listener. He gestured towards a particularly large boulder. Zilvra watched, mesmerized. He is experiencing mirth, and now he is engaging in a one-sided communication ritual. His cognitive functions are deteriorating rapidly. This is a fascinating new phase of terminal distress. Thessa was less analytical, a strange feeling stirring within her. "It is not deterioration, Elder. It is narrative. He is building a story around his end. He is giving it meaning. Meaning is a construct of the living brain to avoid confronting the meaningless," Velk retorted. "The data, however, is pure." And the spike in endorphins during his laughter, followed by the stabilization of his heart rate as he speaks. His body is employing a cocktail of neurochemicals to ease its own passing. Record it all. The human on the screen fell silent for a moment. He looked at the stars again. "I wonder if anyone will ever find this place," he mused. "Find my bones inside this suit. Find Gerald. They'll probably think I was an idiot. Got myself stranded on a rock, but maybe they'll see this cairn. Maybe they'll know I was here, that I was a person. I had a mom. She made the best apple pie you've ever tasted. I had a dog, Buster, dumbest animal on the planet, but he loved me. I had a life, a small, unremarkable human life." He chuckled again, a softer sound this time. "And it ends here. On a Tuesday, on a rock with 3 moons and a friend named Gerald." He leaned his head back against the boulder. "My name," he said, his voice growing fainter, "is Michael. Michael Cole. And I am not afraid. I'm just a little tired." The words were simple, but they carried a weight that transcended language. They were a testament to a life, a declaration of self in the face of oblivion. The data stream on the Xylar screen began to flatten. His heartbeat slowed. His respiration became shallow. "He is entering the final phase," Zilvra announced, his voice reverent. "The pain centers are deactivating. The consciousness is winking out. Record the final neural signature. This is a complete and textbook case of solitary, environmentally induced expiration." On the screen, Michael Cole's eyes were closed. His lips moved one last time, forming a silent word. The translation software, reading the faint muscle movements, offered a guess. "Gerald." Then, the data stream went flat. A single, steady tone indicated the cessation of all biological function. The image on the screen was still. The lone human was just a statue now, leaning against a rock on an alien world. The chronicler's bridge was filled with a profound and clinical silence. "Exquisite," Velk whispered, his voice filled with scholarly satisfaction. The final moments were exceptionally rich in emotional data. The self-narration, the referencing of past relationships, the personification of an inanimate object, a truly superior specimen. This data will be the cornerstone of our next treatise, The Human Termination Narrative, a study in solitary existential distress. Thessa said nothing, and she stared at the still image of the human. The feeling inside her had grown. It was not a scientific feeling. It was something far more uncomfortable. She felt sad. She felt a sense of loss for this being she had never met, this Michael Cole, who had named a rock and talked about his mother's pie. She felt, for the first time in her centuries of life, the sting of an injustice that had no perpetrator. "Prepare the data for long-term storage," Zilvra ordered, turning from the screen. "And archive the visual feed, a fine addition to our records." Thessa moved to comply, her slender fingers dancing over the control panel. As she initiated the data transfer, a subroutine she had never noticed before activated. It was a standard part of their recording protocol, a fail-safe designed to ensure the purity of their data. It was called empathic resonance calibration. The system, having recorded the intense, a multi-layered neurochemical and emotional broadcast of a sentient being's final moments, would now, as a matter of course, transmit a low-level simulation of that experience back to the recording device. It was meant to calibrate their own sensors against the raw data to ensure they were accurately perceiving the pain they were studying. It was a purely technical process, one they had used on thousands of species. It had never produced a side effect. Until now. Thessa felt it first. A faint echo, like a cold whisper in the back of her mind. It was quickly followed by a wave of profound, bone-deep weariness. Then came the fear. Not a fear of a specific thing, but the existential terror of being utterly and completely alone. The crushing weight of a high-gravity world pressed down on her, though she was standing in a climate-controlled observation room. Her mouth felt dry, her lungs burned with an imaginary toxic atmosphere. She saw, flashing behind her eyes, and the face of a human female, smiling, offering a golden-brown disk of food. She felt a love so pure and sharp it was a physical pain. She heard a dog barking. She felt the smooth, unyielding surface of a rock she had named, a rock that was her only friend. Thessa gasped, stumbling backward from the console. Her hand flew to her throat. "Elder Zilvra!" she cried, her voice trembling. "Something is wrong!" Zilvra turned, his large eyes narrowing in annoyance. "Thessa, or what is the meaning of this disruption? Compose yourself." But then he felt it. It slammed into him with the force of a physical blow. The loneliness. The absolute soul-crushing certainty that no one was coming. That his life, his long and storied life of scholarship, was ultimately meaningless. That he would end, not in the hallowed halls of the Xylar archive, but alone, forgotten, on a rock under alien stars. He saw the face of his own hatch-mother, a memory he had not accessed in centuries. He felt a longing for her warmth, a primal and desperate need, his clinical detachment shattered into a million pieces. "No," he whispered, his parchment-like skin paling to a sickly gray. "What is this? Get it out of me." Old Velk, who had been observing the exchange with growing alarm, was the last to be hit. The wave of pain and sorrow that crashed over him was amplified by his age, his proximity to his own death. He saw, with terrifying clarity, and that all his centuries of cataloging death had taught him nothing. He was as unprepared for it as the lowliest creature. He felt the human's final tired acceptance, and it was not a clinical data point. It was a yawning chasm of despair. The human's last thought, "I'm just a little tired," echoed in his mind, not as words, but as a feeling so vast and hollow it threatened to consume him. He felt the cold seeping into his bones, the phantom weight of a failing suit, the burning in his lungs. He collapsed to his knees, his ancient form trembling. For long, agonizing moments, the observation room of the chronicler was a chamber of shared torment. 3 of the most advanced minds in the galaxy were brought low, not by a weapon, not by a disease, but by the recorded pain of a single, dying human. They wept. They cried out for mothers long dead. They curled into fetal positions, overwhelmed by a loneliness they had never known they could feel. And then, just as suddenly as it began to recede. The empathic resonance calibration was a low-level temporary pulse. It was meant for calibration, not permanent implantation. The raw data of Michael Cole's death had been successfully transmitted. The system went dormant. Zilvra slowly, shakily got to his feet. His face was a mask of horror and disbelief. He looked at his colleagues, seeing the same raw terror reflected in their eyes. He looked back at the view screen, at the still form of the human against the boulder. It was no longer a specimen. It was Michael Cole. "What? What have we done?" Thessa whispered, tears still staining her cheeks. "We sat here and watched him die. We recorded it. We treated his suffering like a specimen in a jar." Zilvra had no answer. His entire worldview, built on the foundation of detached observation, had crumbled. He finally understood what they had been studying. It wasn't a biological process. It wasn't a series of chemical reactions. It was a soul laid bare. It was the fierce, irrational, beautiful love of life fighting against the inevitable. It was the creation of meaning in a meaningless void. It was a story. "The data," Velk croaked, his voice broken. He was still on his knees. We must destroy the data." Zilvra looked at him, then at the console. "It's too late for that, old friend," he said quietly. "We have already received it. We will carry it with us forever." In the days that followed, the Xylar science vessel Chronicler did not resume its mission. It remained in orbit around the desolate rocky world. A small shuttle was dispatched. On the planet's surface, 2 Xylar scholars, their movements no longer clinical but reverent, carefully approached the still form of Michael Cole. With great effort, they moved the boulder he had called Gerald and laid his body flat. They gathered the rocks from his cairn and used them to build a proper marker, a simple, respectful monument. But Thessa, her large eyes still holding the echo of shared sorrow, placed a single luminescent crystal from her home world at its base. It was not a scientific gesture. It was a human one. As they left, Zilvra paused and looked back at the small grave under the light of 3 moons. He no longer saw a failed scout or a scientific specimen. He saw a teacher. Michael Cole, in his final desperate act of being human, they had taught them more about the true nature of life and pain than 1,000 years of clinical observation ever could. He had shown them that the ultimate value of a sentient being was not in its longevity or its achievements, but in its capacity to love, to hope, and to face the end with a quiet, tired dignity, naming a rock a friend. And in that lesson, recorded and then shared, he had reached across the void and touched them, changing them forever. The scholars of pain had finally, truly, learned what pain was.